it can be easy to quit or give up in life, especially whenever that thing, that person that you are relying on and depending on goes away. Many of us affiliate God's hand with how he supplies to not only our physical needs, but sometimes also to our spiritual needs. And the way that he supplies to those needs sometimes come and go. And sometimes when that one thing we were depending on leaves, we automatically think, well, God's hand just isn't present in my life anymore. No. God is the same source. He is the source that distributes supplies to help us in our physical and spiritual needs. So that means that God brings people. He brings things in our life to not only supply physical needs, but also spiritual needs. And he does this to strengthen our faith. But sometimes he shifts that supply by taking it away. And sometimes when he takes it away, it's to get our attention, and sometimes it's to change our values or our priorities or the things that we're pursuing because we were trusting too much on the supply and not on the source. So when God shifts the supply, sometimes he's calling us to move onward, to depend on him as our source. So when God shifts the supply, he's doing that to keep you dependent on the source. He's the same source, but there's a different supply. So in 1 Kings chapter 17, we're going to run into this man named Elijah. And Elijah is a prophet. And if you go in the beginning of 1 Kings chapter 1 through chapter 11, you see how Israel was this united kingdom. And in fact, they were under the reign of King Solomon, who was a good king. He was very wise. And then in chapter 12 through 22, we see how this kingdom became divided. This kingdom became weak. And in fact, there were several kings that began to reign, and they were just bad news. They weren't good. In fact, there was a king named Ahab who allowed Queen Jezebel to bring in this Baal god into Israel, which then turned Israel's eyes away from the one true God into Baal. So this looks like a mess. This looks like an absolute mess here in Israel. And a side note that I want you guys to tuck away in your brain is Baal is known as the storm god. So tuck that away as we go into 1 Kings chapter 17, is that Baal is known as the storm god. So the people believed in the culture that Baal was the one who would control any type of weather, any type of rain, thunder, whatever. He was the storm god. So let's go into verse 1. So verse 1 of 1 Kings chapter 17 says this: Now Elijah the Tishbite from Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab, As the Lord, the God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years, except at my word. So when you read verse 1, we see how Elijah is proclaiming to King Ahab his source. In the very first sentence, he says, as the Lord, the God of Israel. So Elijah is declaring, hey, this is my source in life. It is God. It's the God of Israel. In fact, he's also saying that his source is alive and active, and his source is not dead. Because Israel at the time kind of was questioning and wondering, well, where is God right now? Because the society is getting so corrupt and messed up, and the worship has gone from God to now turning over to Baal. And so some people just assume that, well, I guess God's dead now. He's not active. He's not moving anymore. Well, no. In verse 1, Elijah says, the God of Israel lives. So we know that Elijah's source is God. We know the main source is God. That's point number 1, is the source. God is the main source. And in fact, our source today is the same as Elijah's source back then, and he is alive, and he's moving, and he's active, and he's not dead. Even when the culture presents to you of saying that God may not be around anymore, whenever that is thrown at you, you know that you have a source that is alive. How do we know that? Because in the New Testament, we see when Jesus leaves earth, he says, I am sending you my spirit. And we know that the Spirit lives in each one of us who have trusted in Jesus as our Lord and Savior. And the Spirit has come inside of us and is searching our hearts and God's heart, like we talked about a few weeks ago. But another thing is the Spirit is giving us wisdom and guidance and direction to interact with the people around us. So when you have a relationship with God, you never have to worry about his presence leaving you. You never have to worry about that. Even when you're trying to do your own thing and being disobedient, God's presence will always be there. We have a source who will never leave us, and we have a source who will never forsake us. Some of you may be saying, well, you don't understand my situation, Trey. You're right. I don't understand your situation. But I do know one thing. I do understand your source. I do understand that if your source is God, that even though you may not understand your situation, that there's a God who can do above all that you could ever ask or imagine. So don't give up or quit on God when you think that that supply or that person or that thing that you're relying on to carry not only your physical need or spiritual needs, don't quit on God when that thing or person leaves. Because so often we think that God is going to build something, but under our own circumstances. And so it's like, well, God's going to build something, but in order for him to build this has to fall into place, this person has to be there, and then this has to happen. And we have like this step-by-step procedure of how we think God's going to build something. And then the second something doesn't happen according to our plan, we just assume, well, God's hand's removed. But guys, I want to speak specifically into each one of y'all's lives in First Baptist Matthews. I want y'all to know that God is building something here at First Baptist Matthews. If any one of you affiliate with any person that has left this church with God's hand leaving this church, that's wrong. If God wanted these people here, he would have kept them here. He is building something. So we know that we can go onward with confidence and knowing that we have a source that is stable and that is confident. And if things don't go according to our plan or our agenda, we can trust that there's a God who sees the greater good. And in fact, we have a God who can do above all we could ever ask or imagine, like Ephesians 3:20 tells us. Therefore, that means when things happen that we don't understand or comprehend, you're an amazing company, because we know with confidence that God can do above all we could ever ask or imagine. So that means that sometimes we're never going to understand why certain things happen. So in verse 1, we see how Elijah proclaims and declares that God is his main source. We see how he is telling King Ahab that his source is alive. But then the next thing we see is he's declaring that there's going to be a drought. There's going to be no rain, no dew for the next few years except at the sound of his voice. So there's about to be this severe drought. Why is that? Remember in the previous chapter of how Baal is introduced, and Baal is known as the storm god. And so I read this and I see how God is showing, hey, you may be worshiping these other gods, but I'm the one true God. And some of us may be reading this and saying, well, man, that's a little harsh. Like God's having to create a drought and there's gonna be no rain for 3.5 years. That means like it's gonna mess up the economy. It's gonna mess up agriculture. It's gonna mess up food supply. Like that's harsh. No, I wanna switch your mindset there. It's compassion. It's compassion that God would do something like this to get the people's attention. So Baal is known as the storm god. We see how God is commanding Elijah to say there'll be no rain. So it's showing not only his power and his strength, but also his authority. And I want you guys to know that when God is the source of our life, he provides us a foundation that even when problems occur, he can be trusted. He can be trusted. And we know that at the sound of his voice, when he tells us to do something, even if it doesn't make sense, that he's going to provide and that there's provision with his obedience. Let's go into verse 2. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah and said, leave here, turn eastward, and hide in the Cherith ravine. This is east of the Jordan. You will drink from the brook, and I have directed the ravens to supply you with food there. So he did what the Lord had told him. He went to the Cherith ravine east of the Jordan and stayed there. And the ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning and bread and meat in the evening. And he drank from the brook. When you depend on God as your main source, that means you have to listen to him. You have to obey him. You have to obey the things that he's telling you to do. Why? Because God being the main source means that he is the one directing the supply. God knows what to provide, when to provide, and how to provide it. Which leads to my second point, which is supply. God knows how to provide and what to provide. When you depend on God as your source, you know that he can be trusted, even in the most strange ways. Like in verse 2, when God is telling Elijah to leave and turn eastward and to hide in the Cherith ravine or the Cherith River brook and telling him to drink from the brook, Elijah had to be thinking in his head, all right, God, you just told me to declare no rain. And Elijah's smart. He's not dumb. And he has to know, okay, well, you're sending me over here to this brook, that river, or that's a river coming from this land. And if you're drying this land, that means this river is going to dry up. So Elijah's not dumb. And in fact, if I was Elijah, I would be thinking, well, God, that doesn't make any sense. Why do you want to send me there when it might just be a matter of weeks or months until it's completely dried up? Maybe even days. Like, are you sure? Like, you're telling me to go there and that's where you're going to supply my needs? That's where my mind would drift off. But what does Elijah do? In verse 5, it says he did as the Lord had told him. He went up and obeyed. He went up and obeyed, which shows me that he was trusting God in a step by step by step. He was trusting God with each step and that God was creating that path for him. And for us with our walk with Christ, it can be so easy to just be looking forward and looking at our path and thinking, God, you're trying to supply us with something that may only last a few steps. That doesn't make sense because I have the rest of my life to live. Well, sometimes God takes us places to prepare us and sometimes to even minister to us to prepare us for another season. So there's something about the Cherith brook that I find very interesting. And Cherith is translated as cut away or cut off, which makes me think that God was taking Elijah to a place where some things in his life were going to be cut away, cut off. We're going to be pruned. God was taking Elijah to a place where he was going to prepare him for another season. Another thing I observe in this passage is when he tells him to leave there, he also tells him to hide. And it makes sense from multiple levels of why God would tell him to hide. I mean, number one, King Ahab was probably after Elijah's life. I mean, Elijah just told King Ahab, hey man, there's not going to be any rain for the next several years until the sound of my voice. So you better believe that Ahab was after this man's life. He's like, you gotta be kidding me. Like, that's gonna mess up the economy. Citizens are gonna be mad. People aren't gonna be having food. They're gonna be getting upset. People were after Elijah. So it makes sense that God would tell him to hide and go somewhere and hide. But there's another thing. God was trying to get Elijah in this hidden place. God was trying to get him behind the closed doors and work in his heart and do something in here. And I wonder, what does your hidden life look like? Do you try to avoid that? Do you try to avoid that time of where people don't see behind closed doors? Because wherever you are behind closed doors, whatever you are as soon as you run going home, whatever you go to is showing others what you're depending on. And if you want to depend on God as your main source, then the first question I would ask you is, well, what does your hidden life look like? Are you going to God? Are you drawing near to him? So God was trying to work in Elijah's life in this hidden life. Sometimes God takes us in that hidden life to minister to us, to prepare us to minister to somebody else when the supply shifts. So notice here how God tells Elijah to go there. He says, go there, and that's where I will provide for him. And as he went there, the brook taught Elijah this one lesson. It taught Elijah that the source is dependable and will provide even in times of trouble. Because remember, he's going to this brook that he knows one day is going to dry up. I mean, it's just, how does it not dry up? Because the drought's been declared over the land. That brook is going to dry up. So imagine the faith that it had to take for Elijah to go there and knowing that God was going to supply his physical needs there, but also take care of him spiritually. It took faith to go there. The brook taught Elijah the source is dependable. Another thing that's interesting to point out is this raven. Now, ravens are known as birds of the prey. In other words, a raven is known as a bird that's going to come and steal your Lunchable when you're trying to have a picnic. I mean, it's going to come swooping in. And I mean, has anyone, I'm just really curious. Has anyone had a picnic and a raven come and stolen their food? Okay, anyway, that was a bad example. I was just wondering, I was like, man, like I will go to the grocery store for you. And anyways, I got off track there. But ravens were known as animals that come and steal food, not provide food. So it's interesting how God would use a raven to provide for Elijah's physical needs. Another thing is ravens were known as an unclean animal. And in Jewish tradition, you didn't affiliate with unclean things. You would not affiliate with an unclean animal. And we see how God is using this raven and showing, hey, this is an unclean animal that I'm actually going to use. And in a way, I see how God is showing us how he can use unclean vessels to supply and be used by him. And that's beautiful. That is so beautiful that here in 1 Kings, we're seeing how God can use broken and messy things for his glory and for his good. Another thing I want to point out is that provision always comes with obedience. So I'm going to ask Grant to come up to the stage, and Grant is going to represent this raven, right? So there we go. There's my boy. Here's the raven. So neither of us have majored in theater, but I just want to try to act out this. And a lot of you are like, oh goodness, this is about to be crazy. But I want to act out verse 2-6 with you guys so you can kind of get a feel for what this is like. Because we see that the Lord tells Elijah to go to this river. And once he goes there, we see that the raven, my boy Grant, is going to provide bread and meat in the evening and bread and meat at night or in the morning and evening. So imagine, here he is. Here comes Elijah. Here's the raven. We've got our flowing river, here's the Cherith River right over here. So Elijah comes to the river. There's the raven. He gets his supply for the day. Next day passes by. He comes on over. Now, we don't know how many days this was. If you keep reading this chapter, you can see how it was probably, we know in 3.5 years there was a drought. So it was probably a couple months, couple of years. But as Elijah's going, this supply of this raven giving him the bread and everything starting to become dependable, starting to trust in that, where he knows that this is a supply he can go to, where he can have his physical needs taken care of. But then we see something. We see something in verse 7. Elijah goes to the brook, and it's dried up. And it's dried up, and that raven's not there. Check this out. So sometime later, the brook dried up because there had been no rain in the land. Then the word of the Lord came to him. Now I want to focus in on the brook dried up, because that brook was becoming a dependable supply for Elijah. Because remember, he's in this drought. That was his source of physically being met. God had aligned that supply to take care of his needs. That supply was starting to become a thing of where he was depending on it and trusting in it. So why would God allow that brook to dry up? Because that was the thing of where he was being supplied his physical needs. God allows the brooks in our life to dry up so we don't depend on them rather than the source. Because remember, God's the main source. God's the one who supplied that raven to go down to the river and supply the physical needs for Elijah. God's the main source. God didn't create that raven to be something for Elijah to depend on. He didn't create that supply to be dependable. It was just to help him and provide for him for the season. So God allows the brooks in our life to dry up so that we don't depend and trust on the supply rather than the source. And something I've noticed in my own personal life is that whenever I start depending on that raven or that supply of taking care of me, and I begin thanking it, I start depending on it, sometimes God will shift that. He'll shift that supply out. Because if you begin to trust your supply instead of your source, your faith has absolutely no foundation. The foundation of your faith is in God and as your source. Your foundation is in what Christ has done for each one of you. Your foundation is in, hey, even though life is just horrible right now, I know that my hope is secured in Christ because of the things that he has done to bring me back in full relationship with God. So the supply isn't what's going to sustain you. Why? Because God didn't create the supply to be the source for you to build a foundation on. Now, many of us depend on the supply of money. It's like, okay, well, once I just get 6 figures, I'll be good to go. And then it's like, well, no, once I get 7 figures, then I'll be set. But once we depend on the supply of money, we start to realize that that's not a source to depend on. Because what happens when money doesn't actually buy you happiness, when you thought your whole life and career that money bought you happiness? What happens whenever that job that was providing that money goes away? Money and things of this earth, they're not created for us to rely on as our source. Now, community and friendships is amazing. It's great. But you can't depend on somebody's relationship with God to set the pace for your relationship. Because sometimes if we depend on a person for our faith, sometimes God shifts that person out of our life. Sometimes God shifts that person who is almost in a way spiritually feeding us. He shifts them away. And we can't be sitting at the brook getting mad at God and be like, God, like you told me to go here, now I'm here and now it's gone. Like we can't be getting mad at God because a brook is drying up in our life. The thing that was supplying our physical need is going away. We need to turn our focus and realize that the God who is the main source, distributed that supply to take care of us, might just be trying to shift us somewhere else. He used that to strengthen us, but it wasn't meant to be relied upon. So if you begin depending on the supply will disappoint because it wasn't created to sustain you. The third point is shift. When the supply shifts, I want you guys to always remember that the source remains the same. Check this out in verse 7. Sometime later, the brook dried up because there had been no rain in the land. Then the word of the Lord came to him and said, go at once at Zarephath in the region of Sidon and stay there. I have directed a widow there to supply you with food. So he went to Zarephath. When he came to the town gate, and a widow was there gathering sticks. And he called her and asked, would you bring me a little water in a jar so I may have a drink? And as she was going to get it, he called out and said, bring me, please, a piece of bread. So something that we see here is Elijah's going to this brook. He goes to this brook, it's dried up. The raven's no longer there. Remember, there's a drought. I mean, my boy's really hungry. He's hungry now. He's got to eat somehow. and God dries up this brook. But then instead of sitting there and complaining and saying, God, like why? Like why did you allow this brook to happen? Elijah's response is posturing himself to hear from God. Okay, this is dried up, what's next? Instead of his heart being upset and mad at God, he puts himself in a position saying, what's next? He hears God's word. And the word of the Lord came to him and said to go to Zarephath. Okay, so something interesting about this city is that this city was the center of Baal worship. So here, God took him into this hidden place, prepared him to minister to other people. But then next thing you know, we see how, and part of the preparation of the hidden place, how God is sending Elijah to the center of Baal worship. He's sending him to go back. He's sending him to go back to a land that has gone far away from God. He's sending him to go back to help point people and shift people back to the Lord. So Zarephath is the center of Baal worship. Another thing to note here is that at the time, widows were very, very poor. Like very poor. Like Elijah would be better off going to the dry river and depending on that to provide some type of bread and manna again. So a widow was very, very poor at the time. And God's telling him to go to this widow. Again, it's so beautiful to see how God uses the things that we would totally doubt God to use to supply not only our physical needs, but also our spiritual needs. So we see that the shift begins to move in Elijah and how God's calling a Zarephath to go and meet a widow. And we see that he finds and comes across this widow picking up sticks. I mean, can you imagine like you're walking into the city like, and you come in, there's the gate, and then here's this widow like on her knees just like picking up sticks. And I'd be thinking, okay, so that's the one who's going to provide for my needs, all right. And there he goes and talks to her, and then he finds out that she really doesn't have much at all. Check this out. In verse 12, she says, as surely as the Lord your God lives, she replied, I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and just a little olive oil in a jug. I'm gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die. A few things to note here. Number one, the widow is pulling in the last straw. She's saying, look, this is the final meal. Like, I mean, I'll cook for you, but I just have a little bit of flour and a little bit of oil left, and that's it. And honestly, my son and I, we're preparing to die after this. This is our final meal. Like, this is all I have. I mean, again, think about Elijah thinking, oh goodness, like, all right. No. Remember, back in the hidden place, God was preparing him and showing him, hey, you can go to the places that in all common sense doesn't make sense to go to, and how I will still supply for your physical and spiritual needs. He taught him that over there at the Cherith River. So now when he comes to this widow, he's able to give her hope. He was shifted from that river to minister to somebody. He was moved to minister to this widow. So in verse 14, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel says, the jar of flour will not be used up and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day of the Lord sends rain on the land. So she went away and did as Elijah had told her. So there was food every day for Elijah and for the woman and her family. For the jar of flour was not used up, and the jug of oil did not run dry, in keeping with the word of the Lord spoken by Elijah. I love here how Elijah addresses this woman's fear. Because she comes to Elijah saying, I have nothing. I have a handful of flour and I have a little bit of oil and that's it. Elijah addresses that fear and he says, in the very next verse in 13, to not be afraid. He takes the widow's current crisis and he says, hey, shift that fear and take that and place trust in God. Like, yes, like I understand you're in a crisis, but like shift fear to trust. And why would he say this? Because he knows that God is trustworthy. God had taken him to the Cherith River and where God had proved himself to be a trustworthy God. And that even when the supply may not seem substantial or that could carry you, like he has taught Elijah that he can be trusted, that he is a dependable source. Now, something I want to point out here is that the point of this story isn't that God was able to take care of this widow's physical and needs and her and her family, because we see in verse 16 that God gave her enough bread and oil to supply food for her and her family for the rest of the famine. Like, that's amazing. It's amazing that God did that. But God didn't just take care of her physical need to leave her there. He took care of her physical need in essence to show her her spiritual need. The point of the story is that, yes, God supplied Elijah and this widow and her family enough food during the drought. But the main point of the story is that God moved Elijah to minister to this widow to show her a source that can be trusted no matter the condition of life. And I have a question for you. How many situations have you been in when you've seen God do the miraculous? Now, God doing the miraculous might be meaning that you're in a situation right now where you're ready to give up. Maybe you're filled with a lot of fear. Maybe there's a situation where you feel like that widow and where she's like, only have a little bit of flour and a little bit of oil. And after that, I'm planning on dying. Like, I'm done. Like, final straw, like game over. How many of you guys might be in a fearful situation? Well, in this story, we see how God took a fearful situation and turned it into a miraculous one, where he took care of a woman's physical needs. But then we see in verse 24 that the woman said to Elijah, now that I know you are a man of God and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth. We see how this woman, she shifted from identifying God as Elijah's God to in verse 24 saying that God is a God who can be trusted. She placed her faith in this God. So what's so beautiful is how there is just this messy situation where God would opened up a door for Elijah to minister to her too, and God did the miraculous. So I'm gonna challenge you guys this week. Go back home, maybe you have this conversation in the car, maybe you have it at lunch. What's that one thing in life where you've given up on? But that one thing you're giving up on might be the miraculous things God's trying to do. So I want you to know that God sometimes will shift the supply and the way he takes care of us and then move us to minister to someone who needs it. So God shifts the supply to keep you dependent on the source. So church, we have to go because we have a promise. We have a promise and we have a message of hope. We have this anchor as a firm foundation like Hebrews 6:19 says. We know that Jesus has come down to earth, and we know that if he lives inside of our heart because you publicly declare with your mouth and believe in your heart that he is Lord and that you will now be saved, we know that we have a future with God in eternity where there'll be no more brokenness, there'll be no more sin, no more shame, there'll be no more guilt, there'll be no more tears, no more weeping. We know that there's an eternity that is hopeful. So we know that our time here on earth, even though things may not make sense and that things may happen that just doesn't make sense, we know that we have a trustworthy supply, or we have a trustworthy source. We know that we have a God who directs the supply, and he is a trustworthy source. So our supply it's not meant to give us confidence. Yes, we have a God who is willing to meet for our needs and take care of our needs. We see that in Philippians 4:19 and 1 Peter 5:17. We see how there's a God who wants us to cast all of our anxieties on him. And yes, he will supply things. He'll bring people into our lives. He'll allow situations to come into our life to help us. But ultimately, he brings those things to take care of our spiritual need. So God is a source that can be trusted. So don't give up on God when he shifts that supply. So I want to challenge some of you guys in here today. As the band comes up, there's a few things I want to challenge you with. When you're depending on God as your source, you know that you can go to him in times of need. Because of Jesus, we know that we have this hope as an anchor for our souls. You know you can draw near to your source with confidence. You know that when you have that as your main source. So some of us in here today, we may just need to take that step of faith. We just need to take that step of faith of saying, all right, I'm tired of putting God to the side and giving up on him. Like today, I'm just going to say, all right, I'm all in. I'm going to trust you as my main source. I'm not going to be relying and depending on the supplies and all that, taking my physical need. Like there's something more. Like I know that's taking care of my need, but I know there's something more for me. If that's how you're feeling, know that God is wanting you to take a step of faith. Like God is calling you today to turn to him. And I promise you it's the best decision that you'll ever make. Some of us in here, we've been so dependent on the supply that we've kind of forgotten that our main source is God. We've forgotten that our source of joy and hope and life comes from God, because we've been finding that so much in a person or a place or a thing. But we need to shift, and we need to shift our focus of going back to God as our main source. Some of us, we've been in a time of hiding and where God's been pruning in us. He's been working us. He's been cutting some things away. He's been showing that he's trustworthy. And now he's calling you to move. Because you might be over here at the brook of where you've been in this hidden place for a while. You've been sitting there like, man, there's something more. Like it's dried up. What happened? It could just be that God's trying to shift you to go and minister to somebody, like this widow with Elijah. There's a message of hope that we carry. So as we stand, I just want to give you a chance to respond. If you want to come up and speak to a minister, or if you want to talk to the person next to you and just say, hey, there's something about a main source that I was hearing today in God. I want to know more about that. Or maybe there's someone beside you who you know is hurting. You just need to pray over them. Maybe there's someone who just needs to realign their focus back onto God. Whatever it is, I want you to know that God shifts the supply to keep you dependent on the source, and he is so trustworthy. So let's pray.